When 72-year-old billionaire Richard Mansfield fell in love with a woman 40 years younger, his family screamed, "Grandpa, she's too young for you." But when he discovered she was pregnant, the shocking truth he uncovered would change everything. He thought he knew about love, family, and the people closest to him. The autumn rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Mansfield Industries boardroom on the 47th floor of Manhattan's most prestigious business district. Richard Mansfield, 72, sat alone at the massive mahogany table that had witnessed countless billion-dollar deals. Yet today it felt more like a judge's bench than a place of power. Despite commanding a business empire worth over $3 billion, the silver-haired titan looked smaller than usual, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he stared at his phone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 17 missed calls from his son, David. 8 angry voicemails from his daughter, Sarah. 3 threatening text messages from his youngest, Michael. The same accusations, the same fury, the same words that had been echoing in his ears for months. "She's using you, Dad. Can't you see what she's doing? She's young enough to be your granddaughter. This is humiliating our family name." Richard's chest tightened as he thought about Emma Rodriguez, the 32-year-old art therapist who had walked into his life 6 months ago during the Metropolitan Museum's annual charity gala. While his children saw a calculating gold digger preying on a lonely widower, Richard had found something he thought was lost forever after his beloved wife Margaret's death 5 years ago: genuine companionship, infectious laughter, and a reason to look forward to waking up each morning. Emma wasn't like the socialites and fortune hunters who had circled him like vultures after Margaret's funeral. She had her own small but successful art therapy practice, working with trauma survivors and children with disabilities. When they'd met at the gala, she hadn't even known who he was until someone whispered his name. Her first words to him weren't about his wealth or status, but about the haunting sculpture they'd both been admiring, a piece that reminded her of her late father's struggle with war-induced PTSD. That conversation had lasted 3 hours, meandering through art, loss, healing, and hope. For the first time in years, Richard felt seen not as a billionaire or a business legend, but simply as a man who had loved deeply and grieved profoundly. His phone buzzed insistently, snapping him back to the present crisis. A text from his personal assistant, Catherine. "Mr. Mansfield, the family meeting has been moved to 4 p.m. Your children are quite insistent about discussing Miss Rodriguez." Mr. David mentioned bringing the family lawyers. Richard's stomach dropped. The lawyers. This wasn't just another family dinner where his children would lecture him on appropriate behavior for a man his age. This was the intervention they'd been threatening for weeks, a formal challenge to his mental competency, his control over the family trust, his very autonomy as a human being. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same children who had been absent from his life for years, too busy with their own careers and social climbing to visit their grieving father, were now suddenly concerned about his well-being. David, the ruthless corporate lawyer who hadn't called him Dad in a decade, only Richard or Sir. Sarah, the socialite whose charity work was more about photo opportunities than genuine compassion, who had openly resented the attention her mother received during her final illness. Michael, the youngest and most entitled, who had burned through 3 trust fund advances before his 35th birthday and still expected Richard to bail him out of every financial mess. They'd watched him spiral into depression after Margaret's death, barely acknowledging his pain except to ensure the family business continued generating their substantial allowances. But the moment he'd found someone who made him smile again, who encouraged him to travel, to try new restaurants, to remember what it felt like to be alive rather than just existing, suddenly they were concerned about his judgment. Richard stood and walked to the window, watching the pedestrians far below navigate the wet streets like ants. His reflection stared back at him, still tall at 6'2", his silver hair perfectly styled, his navy suit immaculate. He looked every inch the commanding presence that had built an empire from a small construction company inherited from his father. Yet inside, he felt like that frightened boy who had watched his own father work himself to death, promising never to let wealth come before family. Now his family was weaponizing that very wealth against him. His mind drifted to Emma's apartment in Brooklyn, a cozy space filled with her artwork and the scent of jasmine tea. She'd been distant lately, claiming she was overwhelmed with work, but Richard suspected the constant media attention and his family's hostility were taking their toll. Paparazzi had started following her to work. Social media trolls dissected every photo of them together, calling her a sugar baby and worse. His children's friends whispered about the embarrassing May-December romance at every charity function. But what his children didn't know, what Richard was about to discover in just a few hours, would shatter everything he believed about their motivations. The meeting scheduled for 4 p.m. wasn't just about their moral objections to his relationship. It wasn't even about protecting the family reputation or ensuring their inheritance remained intact. The real reason his children were so desperate to separate him from Emma had nothing to do with age, appropriateness, or concern for his well-being. The truth was so much darker, so deeply rooted in greed and manipulation, that it would make their public complaints about the age gap seem like mere theater designed to hide their true agenda. As Richard gathered his papers and prepared to face his children's ultimatum, he had no idea that within hours, Emma would reveal news that would change everything. News that would expose his family's real motivations and force him to choose between the empire he'd built and the woman who had given him back his will to live. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one brewing within the Mansfield empire, and Richard was about to walk straight into its eye, where he would discover that sometimes the people closest to you are the ones with the sharpest knives. Mansfield family conference room fell silent as Richard entered at precisely 4 p.m. The mahogany-paneled space, usually reserved for board meetings and merger negotiations, now felt like a courtroom. His 3 children sat aligned on one side of the polished table, like prosecutors, their expensive suits and stern expressions creating an imposing wall of disapproval. David Mansfield, 45, adjusted his Armani tie and opened a leather portfolio with the precision of the corporate lawyer he'd become. As the eldest, he'd always considered himself the heir apparent to both the family business and the role of family patriarch. His angular face, so much like Richard's in his younger days, carried an expression of practiced authority. "Dad, thank you for coming," David began, his tone formal and distant. "We need to discuss your situation with Miss Rodriguez." Sarah Mansfield Whitmore, 42, sat perfectly poised in her Chanel suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe chignon. The wife of a prominent investment banker and mother of 2 teenage children, she'd built her identity around maintaining the family's social standing. Her blue eyes, inherited from her late mother, held none of Margaret's warmth. "Father, we're worried about you," Sarah interjected, her voice carrying the practiced sympathy she used at charity luncheons. "This relationship is becoming quite the topic of conversation in our circles. People are starting to question your judgment." Michael, the youngest at 38, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Unlike his siblings, he'd never quite found his footing in life, bouncing between failed business ventures and extended European vacations funded by his trust fund. His designer stubble and expensive casual wear gave him the appearance of someone trying too hard to seem effortlessly wealthy. "Look, Dad," Michael said, attempting a more casual approach. "We get it. You've been lonely since Mom died. But Emma, she's not like us. She doesn't understand our world, our responsibilities." Richard remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back as he studied his children. These were the same people who had barely visited during Margaret's 2-year battle with cancer, who had skipped family dinners for years, who had reduced their relationship with him to quarterly financial reports and holiday obligations. "And what world is that exactly?" Richard asked quietly. "The world where family only matters when money is involved?" David leaned forward, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "That's not fair, Dad. We're trying to protect you." Emma Rodriguez appeared out of nowhere, and suddenly you're acting like a teenager with his first crush. "Do you realize how this looks? To our business partners, our investors? How it looks?" Richard's voice rose slightly. "I'm 72 years old, David. I think I'm beyond caring about appearances." Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through what appeared to be social media screenshots. "Father, please look at this. Billionaire sugar daddy is trending on Twitter. There are memes about you on Instagram. The New York Post ran a piece calling it May-December Madness. This is affecting all of us." She slid the phone across the table, showing Richard a particularly cruel cartoon depicting him as a doddering old man being led around by a young woman holding a leash made of dollar bills. His jaw tightened as he saw the humiliating image. Michael jumped in, sensing his father's reaction. "We've had reporters calling our offices, Dad. Sarah's country club friends are asking pointed questions. My kids are getting teased at school about their gold digger step-grandmother. This isn't just about you anymore." David stood and walked to the window, his movements calculated for maximum dramatic effect. "Dad, we've been discussing this situation extensively. We think there's a solution that could work for everyone." "I'm listening," Richard said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "We'd like to offer Miss Rodriguez a substantial financial settlement," David continued, not meeting his father's eyes. $2 million, tax-free, in exchange for her stepping away from the relationship quietly. "We've already had our lawyers draw up a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Richard felt as though he'd been punched in the stomach. His own children were trying to buy off the woman he loved like she was a business problem to be solved. "You want to pay her to leave me," Richard said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Father, if she truly cares about you, she understands that this is what's best for the family. If she refuses, well, that will tell us everything we need to know about her motives, won't it?" Michael nodded eagerly. "It's actually generous. Dad, $2 million would set her up for life. She could expand her little art therapy practice, buy a nice house somewhere far from New York. Everyone wins." David returned to the table and placed a document in front of Richard. "We've also prepared some additional safeguards for your protection. A revised trust structure that would ensure your assets remain secure, regardless of any future romantic entanglements." Richard picked up the document and scanned its contents. Legal jargon filled the pages, but the message was clear. His children wanted to strip him of his financial autonomy under the guise of protecting him from Emma's supposed gold-digging schemes. "You're asking me to choose between the woman I love and my own family," Richard said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "We're asking you to be realistic," David replied sharply. "You've known this woman for 6 months, Dad. 6 months. How can you possibly think you know her well enough to trust her with your heart, let alone your fortune?" Sarah softened her tone, trying a different approach. "Father, you know how much we loved Mother. No one could ever replace her, and we're not asking you to spend the rest of your life alone. But Emma Rodriguez, she's not suitable. Find someone age-appropriate, someone from our social circle who understands the responsibilities that come with the Mansfield name. Someone you can control, you mean," Richard said bitterly. The tension in the room was palpable as the 3 siblings exchanged glances. They had expected resistance, but they hadn't anticipated the depth of their father's emotional investment in this relationship. "Dad," Michael said finally, "we're prepared to make this legally binding if necessary. We've consulted with specialists in geriatric psychology who could testify that this relationship shows signs of diminished capacity. We don't want to go that route, but we will if we have to." The threat hung in the air like a sword over Richard's head. His own children were prepared to have him declared mentally incompetent if he didn't comply with their demands. The empire he'd built, the independence he'd maintained, the right to choose his own path in his golden years, all of it could be stripped away by the very people he'd sacrificed. So much to provide for Dot as Richard stared at the legal documents before him. He realized this wasn't just about Emma anymore. This was about power, control, and a family that saw him not as a father to be respected, but as an asset to be managed. What he didn't know was that their motivations ran much deeper than protecting the family reputation or securing their inheritances. The real reason his children were so desperate to separate him from Emma was about to reveal itself in the most shocking way possible. And when it did, Richard would understand that this meeting was never about his happiness at all. It was about covering up a secret that could destroy everything the Mansfield family had built. Richard left the family meeting feeling as though the ground beneath his feet had shifted permanently. The ride back to his penthouse on the Upper East Side passed in a blur of rain-slicked streets and neon reflections, his mind reeling from his children's ultimatum. $2 million to make Emma disappear. Legal threats disguised as concern. The empire he'd built being used as a weapon against his own happiness. His phone buzzed constantly during the 20-minute drive. Messages from David's law firm, emails from family trust administrators, and a particularly cold text from Sarah. "Father, please consider our proposal seriously. We only want what's best for you. The offer stands until tomorrow at noon." The doorman at his exclusive Fifth Avenue building greeted him with the same respectful nod he'd offered for the past 15 years, but Richard barely noticed. The marble lobby, with its crystal chandeliers and priceless artwork, felt like a mausoleum rather than a home. Everything around him represented the wealth and status that had defined his life. Yet now it all seemed like gilded chains binding him to his children's expectations. His penthouse apartment, spanning the entire top floor with panoramic views of Central Park, had once been his sanctuary. Margaret had decorated it with warmth and personality, family photos, fresh flowers, books scattered on every surface. After her death, Richard had kept everything exactly as she'd left it, turning the space into a shrine to their 45-year marriage. But lately something had changed. The apartment felt less like a memorial and more like a prison of memories. Emma had never directly criticized the shrine-like atmosphere, but her presence had gently encouraged him to live in the present rather than the past. She'd brought fresh energy to the space, her laughter echoing in rooms that had been silent for years, her artwork brightening walls that had become oppressively formal. Richard poured himself a scotch from the crystal decanter Margaret had given him for their 20th anniversary and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the park. The autumn leaves were turning gold and crimson, and he remembered how Emma had marveled at the view during her first visit, exclaiming that it looked like a painting she'd love to recreate. His children couldn't understand what he saw in her. To them, Emma was an outsider who didn't belong in their rarefied world of private jets, exclusive clubs, and generational wealth. But that was exactly what drew Richard to her. She was real in a way his life had long ceased to be. The sound of his private elevator arriving interrupted his brooding. Richard frowned. His building's security was impeccable, and no one should have access to his penthouse without prior approval. He set down his glass and walked toward the foyer, his heart rate quickening. The elevator doors opened to reveal Emma, but she looked different than he'd ever seen her. Her usually vibrant complexion was pale, her dark eyes red-rimmed as though She'd been crying. She wore a simple black coat over jeans, a stark contrast to her usual colorful, artistic style. In her hands, she clutched a manila envelope that seemed to weigh more than its contents should. "Emma, how did you get up here? Is everything all right?" Richard rushed to her side, immediately concerned. She looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, part fear, part determination, part something that looked almost like guilt. "Richard, we need to talk. I used the keycard you gave me last month. I'm sorry to come unannounced, but I couldn't wait until tomorrow." He guided her to the living room, noting how she seemed to shrink into herself as she took in the opulent surroundings. Usually, Emma moved through his world with quiet confidence, unfazed by its luxury. Tonight, she seemed almost afraid of it. "What's wrong?" "You look like you've seen a ghost," Richard said, settling beside her on the Italian leather sofa that had cost more than most people's cars. Emma clutched the envelope tighter. "I received some visitors today, Richard. Your children came to my apartment." Richard's blood ran cold. "What? When?" "This afternoon, right after you left for your meeting. They knew exactly where you were, exactly when I'd be alone." Emma's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "David, Sarah, and Michael, they came with an offer." "The $2 million, Richard said grimly. "They told me about their plan." Emma's eyes widened in surprise. "You knew?" "They presented it to me as a hypothetical solution to what they called our situation. I had no idea they'd already approached you directly." Richard felt anger building in his chest. "What did you tell them?" Emma stood and walked to the windows, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. "They were very persuasive, Richard. Very thorough in explaining why our relationship was damaging to you, to them, to everyone involved. And?" She turned back to him, and for a moment, Richard saw something in her expression that made his heart skip. Not the fear or sadness he'd expected, but a flash of something that looked almost like pity. "They showed me things, Richard. Documents. Photographs, financial records." She held up the manila envelope. "They explained why they're really so concerned about our relationship. It's not about the age difference or protecting your reputation." Richard stood slowly, a chill running down his spine. "What are you talking about?" "They're concerned about your will, Richard. Specifically, about how my presence in your life might affect their inheritances." Emma's voice grew stronger, more clinical. "But more than that, they're worried about what might happen if you discover certain irregularities in how they've been managing aspects of your business interests." The room seemed to tilt around Richard. "What irregularities?" Emma opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of papers. "David has been using his position as your attorney to redirect funds from several of your charitable foundations into investment vehicles that benefit his own law firm. Sarah has been inflating the costs of her charity events and pocketing the difference, nearly $500,000 over the past 3 years. And Michael." She hesitated, her voice softening with what might have been genuine sympathy. "Michael has been forging your signature on loan documents, using your assets as collateral for his gambling debts. He owes over $2 million to some very dangerous people, Richard." The scotch glass slipped from Richard's numb fingers, shattering on the marble floor. The sound echoed through the penthouse like a gunshot, but he barely heard it. His children, the people he'd sacrificed everything to provide for, who had lectured him about responsibility and family honor, had been systematically stealing from him for years. "How do you know all this?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. Emma looked down at the papers in her hands, and when she met his eyes again, her expression was unreadable. "Because, Richard, there's something I need to tell you too. Something about why I really came into your life. Something about who I really am." The golden cage of his penthouse with its perfect views and priceless artwork suddenly felt like a trap closing around him. Richard realized that everything he thought he knew about his family, his fortune, And the woman he'd fallen in love with was about to be shattered. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a terrible thought began to form. If Emma knew all these details about his children's crimes, if she had access to documents and financial records that should have been impossible for an art therapist to obtain, then perhaps his children weren't the only ones who had been deceiving him. The storm outside had nothing on the tempest that was about to break inside the gilded walls of Richard Mansfield's carefully constructed world. The silence in Richard's penthouse stretched like a taut wire as Emma's words hung in the air. Something about who I really am. Richard felt his world tilting on its axis, the marble floor beneath his feet suddenly feeling as unstable as quicksand. My name isn't Emma Rodriguez, Richard. It's Emma Rodriguez Brooks. I'm Harold Brooks's granddaughter. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. My grandfather lost everything in a business deal 25 years ago. A deal orchestrated by your son David, who convinced my grandfather to invest his life savings in a property development scheme that he knew was fraudulent. Richard sank into his chair, his mind racing. But David was barely out of law school. He was working under your company's umbrella, Richard. Mansfield Industries backed the deal. Your signature was on the contracts. Emma's voice grew harder. After my grandfather died 5 years ago, I hired a private investigator. What we found was worse than fraud. David has been running similar schemes for decades, using your charitable foundations to pay off victims who might otherwise press charges. Emma pulled out documents from the envelope. Bank transfers, forged signatures, shell companies. It was all there, spanning decades. I planned to get close to you, to gather evidence. But I never expected to fall in love with you. The pregnancy, Richard said suddenly. Are you? Emma's hand moved to her stomach. Yes, I found out 3 days ago. Your children somehow knew before I could tell you because they've been monitoring me. They know about my real identity, about everything. They're not protecting you from a gold digger. They're protecting themselves from someone who could expose their crimes. And there's more, Emma continued, tears streaming down her face. The FBI approached me 6 months ago, asked me to cooperate in their investigation against David. But I stopped cooperating because I couldn't bear destroying you along with your children. Now I'm pregnant with your child, and they're threatening both of us. The elevator doors suddenly opened, revealing David, Sarah, and Michael, their faces grim and determined. Well, David said coldly. Emma Rodriguez Brooks. FBI informant Emma Brooks. Sarah stepped forward, her expression venomous. Did you really think we wouldn't find out, you little gold-digging bitch? Michael delivered the final blow. You killed our grandfather Harold, didn't you, Dad? That business deal that ruined him. He had a heart attack right after it collapsed. And now his granddaughter thinks she can get revenge by seducing you. Richard stepped between Emma and his children, his 72-year-old frame suddenly radiating the commanding presence that had built a billion-dollar empire. The scared, confused man from earlier had vanished, replaced by the steel-spined businessman who had never backed down from a fight. That's enough, Richard's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. For 25 years, you've been stealing from me. David, you've used my company as a front for fraudulent schemes. Sarah, you've looted my charitable foundations. Michael, you've forged my signature so many times you probably do it better than I do. Dad, you don't understand, David began. I understand perfectly. You're thieves. Richard turned to Emma, his expression softening. And you came into my life seeking justice for your grandfather. You were right to do so, and now you're carrying my child. The admission hit his children like a physical blow. Sarah gasped, David went white, and Michael staggered. That child will be my heir, not you three, Richard continued firmly. After what you've done, you're no longer my family in any way that matters. David recovered first. Dad, she's an FBI informant. You can't trust her. Actually, Emma said quietly. I stopped cooperating with the FBI 6 months ago. I chose love over revenge. But they still have their case, Richard said, looking directly at David. Don't they? Emma nodded reluctantly. They have enough evidence to prosecute without my cooperation. Good, Richard said, surprising everyone. Then justice will finally be served. Michael lunged forward desperately. Dad, you can't do this. I owe money to dangerous people. Then you should have thought of that before gambling with my money, Richard replied coldly. Sarah tried manufactured emotion. Father, please, think about your grandchildren, my children. Your children have trust funds I established years ago, funds you haven't been able to touch. But my new child will inherit everything else. Richard moved to his desk and pulled out several documents, updated wills, revised trust agreements. I've suspected something was wrong for months. I've been investigating you for the past year. David's composure cracked. You've been investigating us? Did you really think I'd built a $3 billion empire by being naive? The sound of sirens grew louder, and Emma moved to the window. Richard, there are FBI vehicles surrounding the building. I called them before Emma arrived, Richard said calmly. I told them it was time to move forward. The next hour passed in a blur of federal agents, Miranda rights, and handcuffs. David maintained his composure even as they led him away. Sarah wept dramatically for the cameras. Michael simply looked broken. Through it all, Richard held Emma's hand, feeling more at peace than he had in years. 3 months later, Richard and Emma stood in a small Vermont courthouse, exchanging vows in a ceremony attended only by her uncle Carlos and his assistant Catherine. Emma's pregnancy was just beginning to show beneath her simple cream-colored dress. I know this isn't how either of us imagined finding love, Richard said during their private vows. You were seeking justice, and I was trying to survive my grief. But sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow in the darkest soil. Emma smiled through her tears. If Harold's suffering somehow led me to you, to this love, to our child, then maybe there's a kind of justice in that too. The federal trials were swift. David received 8 years for fraud and conspiracy. Sarah got 5 years for embezzlement. Michael received 3 years and entered gambling addiction treatment. Richard compensated Harold Brooks's surviving family and other victims. The foundations were restructured with independent oversight. 6 months after their wedding, Richard and Emma welcomed their daughter, Margaret Grace Mansfield, named for Richard's late wife and Emma's grandmother. As Richard held his newborn daughter in the same penthouse where his world had nearly collapsed, he marveled at the complete transformation. Do you think she'll forgive us someday? Emma asked, watching Richard cradle their daughter. For how we started, for all the deception. I think love has a way of redeeming even our worst mistakes, Richard said softly. Harold Brooks's granddaughter sought justice and found love. A lonely widower risked everything for happiness and discovered family. And somewhere in all that pain and deception, something beautiful was born. Emma smiled and kissed her husband's forehead. Something tells me Margaret Grace is going to grow up hearing some very interesting bedtime stories. Only the ones with happy endings, Richard promised, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. She'd have enough challenges without inheriting our old battles. As the sun set over Central Park, painting the penthouse in golden light, Richard Mansfield finally understood the difference between having a family and having people who love you. Sometimes the family you choose is worth more than the one you're born into, and sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the most unlikely deceptions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.